So my name is Beth Fisher-Yoshida, and I am the Program Director of the Negotiation and Conflict Resolution Master's Program at Columbia University. And I have a couple of other roles I play, such as being the Executive Director of AC4, which is a consortium we have across campus. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about that now, but just really to talk about the program a little bit. We have monthly webinars, and this is our March webinar, the NECR webinar of Neuroscience of Change. And I am happy in a minute to welcome our guest presenter, Susan Levin, who also is an adjunct faculty member in our program. And the master's program is at Columbia University, as I said. There will be a link put up in the chat box so I can ask somebody to do that, to our website. And also what I'd encourage you to do if you find this webinar interesting, which I trust you will, is to look at the other webinars that we have. We have a whole cadre of webinars that we've had in the past. So if I can just go to the next slide, please. Just wanted to highlight also a couple of upcoming events in case you want to join us. And I have to say that as a program, we are very active. We do have events every month, several events for sure. We have an upcoming event in April, and we have a different time slot because we have somebody who's presenting from Singapore, either Singapore or Jakarta. I'm not sure where Jonathan is going to be at that time. So please make note on April 13th. It's really negotiating a foreign fintech unicorn in a new market. And Jonathan will talk about his use of negotiation and conflict resolution in that role. We also have a workshop session that's taking place in person. So the first one is online. The second one, New Story, New Power, Effective Negotiation workshop, is based on my book. I'll be presenting a workshop, a very interactive workshop in our Midtown location in Times Square. And if you're interested in that, we can also put that link into the website, the chat box rather, or the Q&A box rather, and then you can register with Eventbrite. And then we also have every semester capstone presentations about these wonderful applied research projects. They're actually conflict analysis projects that students do. So we have 29th and 30th. Times will be announced. One day, probably the 29th will be virtual and the 30th will be in person. So if you happen to be near the Columbia University campus, you're welcome to attend. And then we have a May webinar on May 11th. It's about the role of ombuds and how people take up that role. So that'll be exciting as well. Okay, so that's it for the events. I want to introduce Susan a little bit. Susan has a tremendous portfolio of things that she does, and maybe just even giving some of the titles is a lot. She's a facilitator, an educator, dialogue practitioner, and so on. She's had quite a bit of work. She does work globally. I know because we were in transit. I was going to Bangkok, and she was leaving Bangkok just a few weeks ago. And she's done a lot of work for a lot of interesting organizations, some of them based around the Washington, D.C. area, some in New York, some global, and so on. But I think that today's topic is super interesting because everybody's interested in neurosciences lately as we discover more and more about how our brain works and how it affects so many parts of our lives. So then what's going to happen in terms of format is Susan will present for about 30 minutes or so, and then we will have a little bit of a discussion afterwards. And I encourage you at any point in time during the webinar, when you have a question or a comment, please put it into the Q&A box. We're going to hold them until the end, but then you'll have a chance to ask Susan some questions, and we'll go until our time, 1 o'clock, since I'm not sure where you're tuning in from around the world. All right, so I'll turn it over to Susan now. Everybody, please enjoy yourselves.
Thanks so much, Dr. Fisher-Yoshida. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I teach an asynchronous course in the NECR program called The Complexity of Conflict and Change Management. And as part of that course, we explore neuroscience research to reveal how genes and brain structure and hormonal processes impact human behavior during conflict and change. And I also incorporate neuroscience into my other work, as Beth mentioned, a certified mediator and coach, organization development practitioner. And I've designed and delivered a wide range of projects for thousands of employees in international, federal, nonprofit, and corporate organizations in more than 40 countries. And working in partnership with my clients, I use an appreciative approach, and I strive for my work to be culturally relevant, impactful, and sustainable. And the evolution of neuroscience has led to many fascinating insights into the biological and neurological causes of human behavior and the dynamics that can arise and lead to conflict. While I'm not a neuroscientist, I find the research into how the brain works fascinating and important for understanding why humans do what they do, particularly in the midst of change. And the fact that we are all programmed by the functions of the brain is a great leveler for humanity because it impacts everyone, no matter what your background is or where you're from. So the key is to be aware of how the brain determines our actions and emotions and then decide what to do about it. So neuroscience is the multidisciplinary scientific study of the structure and function of the nervous system and the brain, and how it shapes thoughts and emotions and behaviors. And this foundational understanding, which provides evidence that many personality traits, including how to relate to other individuals and groups, has some basis in the biology of the brain. And a number of characteristics of the neural encoding function are the root of and help to explain the conflict that can arise in our social relations and why it's sometimes difficult to prevent and resolve those conflicts. So if I could have the slide, please, of the agenda. So during this webinar, I'm going to cover 3 areas. First, next slide, please. So first, I'll explore the physiology of the brain as well as hormonal reactions, particularly when it comes to change. Humans are hardwired to resist change, especially when it's unwelcome or unexpected. And change is often met with resistance from individuals, teams, and organizations. Second, we will explore how change can lead to conflict and how conflict requires change. And then third, I'll provide some practical approaches to managing conflict that can emerge from change at an individual level, as well as from an organizational perspective. And I'll also cover how brain functions can impact leaders during a change initiative. So to begin, let's look at the basic biology of the brain that offers a window into our initial response to something that is new and different, which is often perceived as a threat. So if I could have the next slide, please. So there's a part of our brain called the amygdala, and amygdala means almond-shaped in Greek, and it's located deep in the middle of the brain's cerebrum. And it's evolved with us through human evolution as a survival mechanism. It's also known as the reptilian brain. That is the fight, flight, freeze, or appease center that you may be familiar with. Imagine many of you maybe have heard of the amygdala. And so when the brain senses danger, the amygdala automatically sends neurotransmitters to process the fearful and threatening stimuli. It alerts us that we're in danger and we need to protect ourselves. So part of the amygdala's job is to detect and react to even the smallest change. And what happens with our brain is it assumes the worst will happen until some new evidence emerges to tell the brain otherwise. So when we were cave people, if the saber-toothed tiger was ready to attack, we were in survival mode. So we either fought back, ran away, or didn't move. And the amygdala gets us ready for that. It prepares the blood flow so that the large muscles get ready to run. And within about 200 milliseconds, our body is flooded with cortisol, which is a hormone that releases stress, and epinephrine, which is also known as adrenaline, and that's a natural painkiller. So adrenaline is a hormone and a neurotransmitter in the central nervous system. It produces effects in the body, and it gets ready to respond to perceived danger. So at the same time, it increases our lung capacity to ensure that we have the energy that we need. So the flood of stress hormones creates sensations like tension in our Our body, our solar plexus, maybe our arms, our voice can change, get higher, lower. We may notice that we're getting heated, our throat is constricting, or some tension in the shoulders or the jaw. And so we are in the grip at that point of a highly efficient but prehistoric set of physiological responses. And these sensations are designed to move us into action. So next slide, please. So here you can see that in about 300 milliseconds, the neurotransmitter travels to the prefrontal cortex of the brain that's here in the front. And that's responsible for our rational, logical decision-making, as well as thought, perception, memory, and executive functioning. So neurotransmitters are chemical messages that our body can't function without. They carry signals from one neuron or nerve cell to the next cell, muscle, or gland. And the prefrontal cortex doesn't fully develop until we're in our mid to late 20s. So if we have any people around that age listening in, and you make a mistake or do something a little goofy, it's not your fault, it's your brain's fault. So try explaining that to maybe your parents. I'm not sure, as a parent, I'm not sure that I would let that go too long, but it is a reality. It is really interesting. And similarly, car rental companies don't allow people under 25 years old to rent cars because at that point, when the prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed, then people tend to take greater risks. And so there's the reason for that. So if we could have the next slide, please. Here are our neurotransmitters. And so today, we may not be physically threatened, but we can still be emotionally charged when our amygdala is on high alert. So I have a recent example of that when I had a client text me, and she said she wanted to talk to me right away in confidence. And she said it wouldn't take long. And immediately, my amygdala was hijacked. And I went to the worst possible scenario. And I thought, oh, I must have done something wrong. And we were in the midst of an intense project. And so what I did was I took a deep breath to relax my emotions. And I was able to talk to her quickly, so I didn't have to wait for days to wonder and ponder what was going on there. And so it turned out that it was about another colleague, and it didn't have anything to do with me. However, my brain went to the worst case scenario and made all kinds of narrative stories up in my head, which turned out to be wrong, fortunately. And we do that all the time in conflict. We make up stories about what happened, about the other person, and it's just what the brain seems to naturally want to do. And then, I wanted to ask you, what are some times when your amygdala was charged by something and your fight or flight mode kicked in to high gear? So what we're going to do now is launch a poll to get a sense of when that might have happened for you. So here you see, when was a time that you felt threatened and your amygdala was hijacked? So you went through something perhaps that I did. And if you could please, you have a multiple choice here to select, and these answers are all anonymous. So don't worry about that. They won't be identified at all. And if you can go ahead and take this poll by just clicking on these answers that are relevant for you, and then click submit, and we'll see what the results are. So let me give you a few moments to do that. Lydia, let me know when the poll is ready to see the results. All right, interesting. So criticized by someone. All right, that's a likely situation to have your amygdala triggered for sure. And then dealing with unwelcome or unexpected change in your organization. Yeah, we are constantly in flux, aren't we? Constantly dealing with change. And because our brain is hardwired to resist, then therefore that can really be difficult and tricky sometimes. All right, thank you so much for taking that poll. And awareness is key. That's the first step. Noticing it in your body, noticing where you feel that tension is really critical. And I have a resource to share with you on the next slide, please. So this is a wonderful resource. The right here, The Body is Your Brain by Amanda Blake. And it's really the seat of intelligence, and listening to it because that's where we know something is coming up and some emotions are coming up for us. And so paying attention to that, keeping aware, having a lens toward that will really help you clue in to what's going on for you. So I highly recommend that. And interestingly, the same regions are activated when we experience both physical and emotional pain. Although the brain doesn't really process emotional and physical pain identically, the research on neural pathways suggests there is overlap between them. So a study at Case Western Reserve University found that exposure to rejection led participants to have an immediate drop in their reasoning by about 30% and a drop in their IQ by 25%. So while we know rejection is inevitable and humans are social creatures by nature, everyone is bound to feel that pain at some point. So the question is how to bounce back. How do you pivot as quickly as possible? And we're going to take a look at some of those approaches later in this webinar. So next slide, please. So here we see that this is just a common occurrence, and recognizing it first is so important somatically. Soma meaning body in Greek. So pay attention to that is really very useful. So a huge change that everyone experienced around the world was COVID-19. And next slide, please. And it's not over, unfortunately. We have all had to adapt. And of course, when it first began, nobody really had a clue of what we were in for, right? Initially, most people like myself thought, okay, it'll be over in a few weeks and we'll get back to normal. And what happened was very different. So our survival mode kicked in. The amygdala was highly activated due to the physical and emotional threat of the reality of getting sick in this global pandemic. So we all had to pivot, adapt, and change, which carries a huge toll to this day. Some people lost loved ones. Many people haven't resumed a normal schedule, returned full-time to the office, or they're working remotely. So during this time of COVID, we had what we called the Great Resignation, where people left their jobs to find better opportunities or make a career shift. And during this tumultuous time, we struggle as the brain is resisting all these changes, and yet we've got to pivot, we've got to shift. So let's explore the role of the amygdala when we're encountering people who are different than us. If I could have the next slide, please. We have these emotions that take over when our instinctual brain feels that we are threatened because this person may not be of our tribe, right? May not belong to our same community. So the survival impulse is to reject him or her. Next slide, please. So knowing this is an immediate physiological reaction to difference can help us understand why we don't tend to initially accept people. However, we don't have to succumb to this power of the amygdala and stay stuck there. We can and we do make a conscientious shift to move beyond that and stay curious and learn more and get to know what other people are about. But acknowledging that instinctual reaction of fear can limit our interaction with people who are different. And so recognizing that, taking a different approach and really keeping the interest and curiosity alive can really help with that. And aside from the amygdala, there are other parts of the brain that can dictate our behavior in reaction to change. So I'm going to go through quite a bit of these different parts of the brain. This is not an all-inclusive webinar on all the various parts. It's very complicated and there's so much, though I think these are the key areas that lead to our reactions and our behavior during change and during conflict. So let's go to the next slide, please. So we have the basal ganglia, which is that light blue circular part you see here that encircles the other colors of the brain in the midst there. And that's near the center of your brain, and it forms important connections that manage the signals your brain sends to move muscles. So its purpose is to save brain energy, which is measured by the amount of glucose in the brain. And that's according to researchers at the Brain and Cognitive Sciences Department at MIT. This part of the brain that handles our routines ensures that the more we do something, the less cognitive energy it takes as we create habits and repeated patterns and behaviors. It frees up brain space to spend more time learning and analyzing. So habits are built through repetition, and it takes 40 to 50 repetitions on average to establish a new habit. That builds up the neural pathway, so scientifically the neurons get thicker. And through repetition, the basal ganglia allows for an automatic response. So when a change is initiated, those habitual patterns are likely to be interrupted, which can lead to discomfort and ultimately resistance. So I have an example of this. I facilitated a senior leadership retreat in a Latin American country. And there was a new director who wanted to make changes to the way the organization was run. And this change meant that people would be assigned to different teams and their roles would change. And so there was resistance from staff who perceived that the change would have negative consequences for them. They were comfortable with the way things were, and the senior leadership team expressed these concerns to the director, who was pretty set on changing things the way he wanted. And since he has the power to do so, he will prevail, though not without some disgruntled staff. So leaders do need to pay attention to the impact of their decisions and provide really clear rationale for changing things. So let's continue to explore another part of the brain. We can go to the next slide, please. More recent technology has allowed scientists to study the habenula, which is near the thalamus deep inside the brain. And the habenula moderates our behavior by releasing chemicals like dopamine and serotonin, which are often called the feel-good chemicals. And that comes up when we do something right. And this is how our brain rewards behavior. So you would feel this coming about when you're praised or given an award. And interestingly, it also regulates sleep patterns. So on the other hand, if we do something that fails, the habenula suppresses the flow of those feel-good chemicals and it makes us feel bad. So it rewards good choices and encourages repetitive, successful behaviors while helping us avoid punishment and failure. So during a change initiative, the habenula becomes active because change can create chances to fail. We have to learn new systems, procedures, new roles and responsibilities, and that challenges the existing patterns and can lead to the resistance. So currently I'm working with another international organization that is restructuring and changing the way the office is organized. So a working group of staff members was formed, and they are going to review different structure options. And this came about during a strategic planning retreat. So for some staff members who aren't part of the working group, there's resistance to this potential change. They're comfortable with the way things were, and they don't really want to make a shift. So reporting lines may change. There may be new job descriptions. And, they're used to their habits that's generated by their habanulas. So they're still in the midst of this change. And one thing that I know will be important is continually communicating with them about what's happening and why. It's so essential during change to keep staff informed. Otherwise, rumors persist and they're really hard to dispel once they get started. So just a word of wisdom is to keep everyone on the same page with the same information. So communicate, communicate, communicate. Another important part of the brain is the entorhinal cortex. So that's on the next slide, please. Thank you. And that's like an internal GPS system that helps us navigate through physical space and helps us get around. So we form these mental maps that help us survive and create a sense of belonging, which humans really want. It creates mental maps of assumptions and beliefs that guide behavior. And so moments of insights get created into this new web of neural connections to the brain. So if you experience a change in your office or organization or in your personal life or in school, it can interrupt that feeling of being part of a community, of belonging. And so if physical moving of workspaces can even disrupt the mental map of where you need to be. And we create social maps of connection. And when these things get shifted, the entorhinal really needs to do some heavy lifting. The amygdala also receives numerous connections from another part of the brain, which is called the hippocampus, on the next slide. And you see it in that red there. The hippocampus is involved in storing and retrieving memories, and its connection to the amygdala may be the origin of strong emotions triggered by particular memories. The hippocampus also specializes in processing sets of stimuli, so the context of a situation. And it's because of the hippocampus and its close connections with the amygdala that the entire context associated with a traumatic event can really provoke anxiety and lots of feelings that can arise. So while we all have an amygdala, there are differences in brain structures and genetics. And some people, actually about 1 in 5 people, have a gene variant called the DRD4-7R. Neuroscience is complicated. And that's on the next slide. So this gene variant indicates that if you've got this gene, you are more likely to be open-minded, flexible, and like new experiences. Other people who don't have the variant and maybe have larger amygdala structures have more of a tendency to be fearful and want greater stability, control, and authority. And this is some really interesting research done by Mari Fitzduff, who wrote a book called Our Brains at War. And I have a slide at the end on resources in which I include that book for your information. So this gene is a variant of the DRD4, and that's a receptor which controls our dopamine levels. And it's a brain chemical which helps to control the reward and pleasure centers in our brains. So when we experience something that we enjoy, dopamine is released. And it helps our brain to associate that thing that causes our pleasure to be associated with it. And so most people get their dopamine fix from small things like eating chocolate, for those of you who like chocolate, Going to some place that you enjoy, a concert, or seeing friends or family, or looking at pictures of happy memories. And that's enough. Others who have a lower sensitivity to dopamine tend to look for bigger, more exciting experiences to increase that release. And so research shows that this gene variant is linked to lower dopamine sensitivity. And that could explain why those with this variant seem to display riskier behavior. In fact, a study conducted by National Geographic found links to curiousness, restlessness, and passion in people with this DR4-7R gene. Really fascinating. So from the perspective of neuroscience, we're constantly struggling between our curious nature and the basic need for reliable and dependable situations, and to stick with what we already know. And the reality is we live in a VUCA world. And next slide, please. This VUCA world, which we all experience, it seems like perhaps with the advent of new technology and know that we are still in the midst of a COVID environment, stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And I know that I certainly feel in the midst of that. I imagine you do too. And while there isn't much stability and consistency, when there isn't enough of that, we feel uncomfortable. At the same time, we want to grow and learn while trying to stay safe and preserve ourselves. But we do like to stick to what we know. And our internal neural circuitry confirms what we already know. So that's why we tend to push back against something new and untested. We're wired to seek safety and belonging. And when things change and transform, it really can disrupt that social contract and that affiliation we have with a workplace, a community, a group. And so while we may not be physically threatened, we can be emotionally charged, certainly. And that amygdala will shut down the neural pathway to our prefrontal cortex, where our complex decision-making disappears, as does our ability to see more than one perspective. We can really be trapped in that one perspective. And then what happens is we get stuck in the place that's safe. So I'm right and you're wrong. So in the heat of a moment where we disagree or we are fighting about something, we can really get entrenched in our viewpoint. And it's so important to recognize when this is happening and to try and see the conflict from the other perspective. It even helps to say so, right? So I could say, if I try and see this from your perspective, I think it's this. And being intentional and specific about reaching out to the other party, building a bridge, trying to build that bridge, and hopefully they will be responding in kind. What's really interesting as I'm going through this neuroscience is just when you think you have a handle on the one brain, neuroscience explains that there are two more brains. So if we can have the next slide, please. In addition to the head brain, which is called the cephalic brain, we have a heart or cardiac brain here, and even our gut or enteric brain. So we've been hearing a lot about the gut brain and how important it is for how we process information, how we react, and listening to all three of these brains is really important. So each has sensory and motor neurons, ganglia, neurotransmitters that process information, store it, and access it when needed. So the head brain is used for thinking, cognitive perception, and creativity. The heart brain processes emotions, values, and connections with others. And that's where passion and compassion resides. And our gut brain is designed to focus on ourselves and our self-preservation. And this is actually the root of our courage. So one way the gut brain is influencing the cardiac brain is through something called the vagus nerve, which runs up and down from the brain to the gut. And that is taxed with regulating critical body functions such as heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, digestion, and even the immune system. So let's take a look at how these three brains can influence leadership. Many times, leaders can be disconnected from their heart and gut brains. They believe that business decisions are best made rationally through data analysis and through thinking it through logically. And that makes sense as well, but they don't always depend on their gut instinct, or do they consider emotions that are involved? So sometimes that can be a limitation. So these three brains take on special significance during a major change. Often processes, systems, and norms change so fast that the old ways of doing things are no longer relevant. And productivity and quality can go downhill, power dynamics shift, and that old amygdala hijack kicks in for everybody across the organization at all levels. So during this pivotal time, leaders need to connect with their three brains. They need the heart for really being passionate about achieving the results of this change initiative. They need to motivate and inspire their employees to adopt new ways of working. And if their heart isn't in it, then people know, and that can be really demotivating for them. An important part of the heart brain is to recognize the impact of change on the morale of staff and pay attention to how they're adapting. So since we're hardwired to resist change, a leader needs to be prepared and ready to explain what's in it for their employees to do something differently. Even better is to involve employees at all levels in formulating the change from the beginning. Often change initiatives fail, due in part to a lack of participation from staff from the very beginning, who will be impacted by that change. Usually it comes from the top, and everyone else is expected to fall in line. Sometimes leaders are caught off guard about that, but it's so important to really take those things into consideration. And assessing and choosing various options, which will likely involve painful decisions and unknown tasks and high levels of uncertainty. So to manage all these moving parts, a leader really needs to enlist all three brains in order to prepare and implement a change initiative. So now that you have a greater understanding of the neuroscience, but behind our reactions to change and the conflict that can result, let's explore some practical approaches to address these challenges. So whether you're dealing with your own conflict or you're a conflict resolution practitioner who's guiding other people to navigate through the disputes, it really starts with you. And one option for moving beyond the limitations of that amygdala is something I call the PRC method, which stands for pause, reflect, and choose. So next slide, please. Now here's our leadership considerations, and go on to the next slide. Okay. This pause allows you to take a moment to just be still, to sit with what you're feeling, to notice those sensations in your body, as we talked about. What tenses up? Does your complexion change? Does your temperature go up? And so it gives the neural impulse about 6 seconds to move from that amygdala back to the prefrontal cortex, which is where you can make more rational decisions. A deep breath allows that to happen. It oxygenates the cells, it calms our nerves. And so I'd like to practice that by taking a deep breath together and just holding it in and letting it out slowly. So if those of you that would like to do this with me, go ahead and get comfortable. And let's take a deep breath in I hope that helps you feel more relaxed. I do that with some of my coaching clients before we start our session, because we're usually rushing from another meeting, and it really helps to get settled and get focused. So in this PRC process, your anger, your feelings, things that get triggered for you, can really come from fear. And so helpful to think about what's the best way forward. What do I want to do? I need to reflect on why these things are coming up for me. What are these circumstances that happen? When are my hot buttons pushed? What are my patterns of reaction? And that way I can anticipate and plan for a better response. And so you won't always know and anticipate when something's going to happen. However, if you've thought about it and planned beforehand, you'll be more ready and not caught off guard. And so that will really help you in terms of being more prepared for the next time that amygdala gets triggered. Another way to manage conflict is also to reframe it, to try and see it from a different point of view. And back to the book, Our Brains at War, she suggests reframing conflict by seeing it as natural and inevitable part of human interaction, because it is. It's not an isolated event. We all have to go through it, and it really can come from differing values and interests and beliefs. And when we realize that it's not a personal attack necessarily or intended to degrade us, we can really see it more as a normal aspect of human interaction. I had this happen when I was with a coaching client, and she is struggling with a relationship with her boss. And she came up with this idea of reframing. And when we like our coaching clients to bring up their own wisdom to find the answers they need. And she thought, she's going to step into the shoes of her boss to see how she's thinking. And that way it can give her a broader perspective to plan the conversation that she needs to have with her. So in conclusion, let's review what I've covered in this webinar. So we first explored the neuroscience that explains why humans are hardwired to resist change and why situations can escalate so quickly and the negative consequences that can result. We looked at how change can lead to conflict and how conflict requires change. And then I offered some practical approaches to managing conflict that you can use during stressful times in your professional and personal lives. So I want to leave you with this final quote here. So between stimulus and response, there's a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. Thank you so very much for listening and your attention. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Susan. That was wonderful, chock full of information. And I know that the audience was very actively writing some comments and questions. Just to reiterate that the recording, which include the slides, not the slides separately, will be available on the NECR website. I did include the NECR website before, but it's basically Columbia University Negotiation and Conflict Resolution Program. So it's SPS, right? That's the school where we are. If people need, maybe we can write it up again, the link to the website, but all of our recordings are up there for the webinars. So we do have quite a few questions that I think you might be able to answer. Some of them get into some specifics. So just take it as you may, because we have about 15 minutes left before we have to close. So one person asked, can you talk about the hormonal complexities of those who freeze or get decision paralysis when faced with conflict or change, right? So I guess it's the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Does the amygdala have different hormones impacting those different reactions? So it's not only about the nerves, but also the hormones.
Yes, absolutely. And the stress hormone that gets released is that cortisol. And when the amygdala does get activated, then that stress hormone comes along with it. And that's when it can really have an impact on what happens in our body. Whereas as the question is asking, what happens when we freeze? And in that moment, that's why a deep breath, giving yourselves some nanoseconds, milliseconds really, to be able to then let that neural impulse go to your frontal cortex, which is where you can make a more rational, logical decision and a better reaction to what's happening in the moment. So give yourself that space when you're in the midst of that. And I think that can help you to react in a more proactive way.
That's great, because I know that when we are in a conflict situation, sometimes if we're uncomfortable, we want to hurry it and get out of it. We want to close it and finish it. Same as when I talk about like negotiation work, and giving yourself that chance to slow down the process and be more in control is really great. And it's not just a nice to have, it's actually that there's a chemical, physical foundation to it. Thank you for that.
Sure.
How much do you feel emotional intelligence plays a role in mitigating or dealing with amygdala hijacking? The whole role of emotional intelligence, I guess.
Yes, that's wonderful. And that's something that I think is so useful. The good news about emotional intelligence is we can all get better at it. It isn't fixed like our IQ, our capacity to learn, or our personality tends to be rather fixed. But with emotional intelligence, by honing it and getting better and better at it, it really can be so valuable in being successful in life. And one of the things that happens in emotional intelligence that you may know is that it evokes our empathy. And the more empathy that we can have, right, when we talked about the heart brain, that is where compassion and passion sits, the more we can try to understand where the other person is coming from, just like trying to be in their shoes and reframe your perspective, even saying it and saying, I'm trying to understand where you are, where your point of view is. And I think it's this. That is demonstrating that you are going beyond just getting stuck in your own right, I'm right and you're wrong, to trying to understand where that other person is coming from. And I think that can really help. I think that's demonstrating emotional intelligence in that case.
Super. Thank you for that. Somebody wanted a technical question is, who's the author of Our Brain at War?
It is Mari Fitzduff. And I have it on the resource slide. So let's go ahead and show those resources so that if anybody does want to take a picture of that or so, there we go. These are all these various resources we use in my course. If I can plug my course in the program, love to have you next time. I'm always learning so much from my students. They're amazing.
Great. Thank you for that. Okay, so we can go back to zooming in on us. All right, now, does DRD47R gene relate to ADD, ADHR, ADH? Okay.
Not being a neuroscientist, I'm not sure about that. It is linked to how flexible you are in situations, how much, because it's also connected to the dopamine levels in our body. And so how much do we want new and exciting and more thrilling experiences? And that's really what it is measuring. So some people, there are those folks that like to do risky things, and there are others who say, like, jump out of an airplane, go bungee jumping, and there are others that go, whoa, no way would I do that. And so, of course, it's a continuum, and there's various levels within our brain, probably. Yeah.
Great. Thank you for that, Susan. Okay, let's see. Would appreciate your perspective on the overlay of cultural differences to the neuroscience of the workings of the brain. What are your suggestions for creating balance in acknowledging both of these elements? I know you did mention you're working in intercultural communications and cultural overlay and cultural sensitivity.
That's one of the things that I think is so critical and important to learn about neuroscience. And one of the things, knowing more about the brain and the impact that it has on our reactions to things, our our interactions with other people is that we're all the same in that respect. I mean, there are differences as we looked at the gene variant and such, but the fact that we are all humans and we all have an amygdala, it really, in a lot of ways, I think it levels us across cultures. And I think if more people understood how the physiology and the neurology and the hormonal operations in our body go, I think we'd have less differences. Now, in the cross-cultural aspects, though, what's so interesting is that we want to be, especially as conflict resolution practitioners, we want to be very mindful of different cultural practices and norms and how we do things. So if we're self-aware, and we know, for example, Americans have a tendency to have more of a direct style of communication, and we might tell it like we see it to varying degrees. In many cultures, that doesn't really do very well. Where it's much more subtle, and you wouldn't be that direct because it could be insulting to somebody. And so it's just really important to understand those various differences in culture, know what happens in your brain, because that's your first physiological automatic reaction to things. And then, of course, we have choice. We have choice to move beyond that. We have choice not to be fearful of the other and to be able to get to know somebody, to move beyond what's really our initial response.
Yeah, thank you. So I like the idea that you're stressing self-awareness, and there isn't one formulaic answer to this. And I think sometimes people are looking for that, not saying that the person asking this question is, but really the awareness and the awareness of all the different things happening. And when we get those emotional responses in our body and those physical responses, it's really sources of information for us to say, okay, what's going on right now? What's happening? Because sometimes we're not even conscious of it. We get hyped up, we get stressful, and we start to act and talk and speed up and all that. And we're not even aware of what we're doing. So just to slow down that process and become aware of it is so powerful in itself.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's why that PRC method might be useful to people. And certainly, as you know, if you're going to be navigating people through conflict, you've got to really be self-aware of what's going on for you, because you don't want to get in the way of moving toward resolution.
Yeah, that's really good advice too, to be aware of yourself as a practitioner. Okay, we have time for one or two more. Good morning. Thank you. Very informative, Dr. Levin. You discussed the cephalic, cardiac, and enteric brain. The heart brain is linked with emotions, and the enteric brain is associated with courage. Can you repeat what's under the cephalic brain again, please?
So that is where our decision-making, executive functioning, rational, logical analysis part of our brain is. And so you can see in a balance how all of that integrated together is so important in terms of being able to operate in the best way possible. And I'm not a doctor, unfortunately, like Dr. Fisher Yoshida. But thank you. Thank you for that.
Sure. What might be a recommendation in case of ongoing threat or danger? Could we lie to our brain about unsafe life conditions?
It can really be challenging, because what happens in those cases when the threat is ongoing is things become chronic. And really it can get stuck physiologically. And so again, by being aware of what can happen, I think it's really helpful if you change it up, change that environment, reframe. Sometimes when I need to think about a different perspective, I literally will turn myself and try to look and see in another way. Try to be in a different environment. It's very helpful to do some venting and have someone that you can talk to about these things and get them out, because otherwise they stay emerged in our body, and they can really, as you well know, flare up and come out in ways that we didn't expect or we didn't want. So it's not easy. None of this is easy. And that's why there are programs like this to provide the skills and expertise and knowledge so that we can all get better at managing the inevitable change and the potential conflict that can result.
Super, thank you. What would you advise leaders who need to sell a change to their team with which they themselves don't agree?
That's a tricky one.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, because sometimes in leadership, especially if you're perhaps in that management place where you're between top leadership and then your direct reports, you don't want to necessarily seem like you are not agreeing with where things are going, or you have to message that very carefully. And so what is important is if the change is inevitable, one thing to say to your team is, okay, we got to do it. We don't have a choice. How can we make this work for us? What are we going to do? And that gives people a sense of, okay, so we do have some semblance of control in the midst of feeling like there's nothing we can do about it. We really do. And I think guiding your team that way, showing that leadership, will really be helpful to help your team move forward if they can also recognize what's in it for them. What's going to make what's going to be better for the team. And so I think keeping that mentality, because we are motivated by what is going to work for us, can help to move the team forward.
Yeah, I like that answer, especially because it highlights authentic leadership so that the leader doesn't have to say, no, this is trash, we're not going to do it, or it's a terrible idea, or say, yeah, let's do it, I really like it, without the emotional attachment there to it. But then also the idea of we're in this together, and it just reinforces the team orientation between leader and other members of the team. So that's a really nice way of being authentic in the moment. I think we have time for one more, and I'm sorry to other people we don't have a chance, but this is such a lively group today. The hippocampus is involved with the pituitary gland, secretes cortisol. How is the hippocampus impacted through chronic trauma when cortisol is continuously secreted? How does this impact one's ability to deal with conflict? It reminds me of maybe something like in a PTSD situation.
Yes, absolutely, because it can certainly lead to trauma and the anxiety that can result. And I would recommend through self-awareness, what's going on for myself, I would recommend that you really do consult with specialists and professionals. Giving yourself that opportunity to talk to a professional social worker, psychiatrist, psychologist, and really to get the help that you may need. I mean, it's really a wonderful thing for anybody, no matter what you're going through, to be able to have someone like that to really, really help and support you.
Great. So we are out of time right now. I was just asking if can the participants see the chat even though they can't write in the chat? I'm hoping the answer would be yes. If that's the case, then Kirsten put up quite a few links here. Our event page link on the website where this recording will be and where the other events recordings are to learn more about the NECR program, which is the Negotiation Conflict Resolution Program, and also our LinkedIn page. And if you do have follow-up questions, please send them along and we will ask Susan to answer them for you. Susan, thank you so much for all of sharing your wisdom with us today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity. And yes, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, bye everybody. Thank you for joining us.